Hello, welcome to this episode of Quaker. In this episode, I'm wanting to look at a term that is used quite a lot in Quakerism, but maybe people don't know why, and maybe people might think it's a bit strange, and that term is the word friend. So the official name of Quakers in Britain, if you want, the organisation, the group to which Quakers belong, is called the Religious Society of Friends. Now, this term might seem strange in terms of if you just never heard that before. You might think, okay, so a religious society, I can understand that, people who do religion and their friends. Sure, okay, what does that mean? And so you might have noticed in some of my other videos that I might refer to Quakers as friends, or especially when I've had guests on, they might refer to Quakers as friends as well. Those terms are relatively synonymous. It was one of the original names that Quakers called themselves. Quakers was originally not necessarily pejorative, but was a term given by others about Quakers, and they took on that name and used it alongside their own name, which they would be friends. The early Quakers called themselves other things as well, like the Publishers of the Truth, which I think is a great name. We should have imagine just being called the Publishers. That'd be interesting. But that the ones that really stuck to this day are Friends and Quakers, and they can be used. It's not like we today obviously find the word Quakers offensive or anything like that. I suppose Friends is maybe a bit more of a you'd have to know that word. I think probably if people know about Quakerism, they're more likely going to know the word Quakers than friend. Um, and it can be a bit confusing, obviously, because the word friend is so used that it can be a bit difficult as to know, well, is this a friend or a friend, capital F? So it makes it a bit of a complicated term. So therefore, Quaker is kind of used more generally. I think if I'm talking to people who certainly aren't Quakers, I wouldn't use the word friend to avoid that confusion. So where does it come from? So hardly surprising, but it comes from the Bible, and in particular, it comes from John 15:15. So this is where Jesus is giving "I am the true vine" message, and it goes like this. I'm reading the King James, so that's why it sounds weird. Henceforth I call you not servants, for the servant knoweth not what his Lord doeth, but I have called you friends. For all things I have heard of my Father I have made known unto you. Which I wasn't actually, I knew that it came from the Bible. I wasn't, completely ignorant, but I didn't necessarily know the quote that it came under. But I think that quote's really important. So I thought I'd unpack that a bit, and maybe see what that might say about who Quakers say that they are. So in that phrase, Jesus basically says that he's making the distinction between a servant and a friend. And I'd much rather, I suppose, consider myself as a friend of Jesus than as a servant of Jesus, but maybe that's my modern sentimentality. Not sure. But I think what he's getting at there is that the servant does what he does, not because he knows why he's doing it, but because he's been told to do it. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But I suppose Quakers always like to think of themselves as working alongside the divine, working alongside working with the inner light rather than being told and dictated to by the inner light. Not that is, I suppose, in a religious setting necessarily wrong. I think, the authority of the divine is not necessarily a bad thing. I think if you're going to put yourself to any authority, I think that's the one that you ought to put yourself up against. But um, I think it's this. The Quakers have always had a very strong idea that it's a conversation. It's about it's about the free spirit of man working with the Holy Spirit, and that being being a conversation, then orders being given. And so I think the idea of a friend fits much more nicely into that conversation with God. I think also for early friends, they believed that they were friends of Jesus because Jesus was in their meeting all the time. It wasn't just listening to the words and the law and whatever from through the Bible. Jesus was someone who came to meeting and ministered at meeting. It wasn't some faraway figure. It was someone who was actually there. The early friends had a really strong idea of the presence of Jesus, and that it wasn't someone that you could only hear of in the Bible. It was someone that came and sat beside you and talked to you. I think they also thought that they had a very important message to give, in terms of that they that so in that bit where it says, um, uh, for all the things I have heard of my father, I have made known to you. So that they, especially early friends, they thought that they had a radically new understanding. Well, new, I suppose, maybe not the right word. That they thought that they had that full understanding of what Jesus had learned from the Father, or God, and this I suppose would be what he's referring to, and that the Quakers understood that in that whole understood that wholly in a way that maybe the Church of England or any of the other dissenting Christian movements at the time didn't, and that was the message that they understood and wanted to share, and so therefore could call themselves friends. I suppose it's an interesting point of what how Quakers see each other as well, so that that it creates this sense of community, that these are not just fellow parishioners or fellow worshippers or anything like that. They're friends, and I think that that is nice because although obviously it's coming from a very different place than the idea of a friend, um, in a worldly sense. I think all the same, I think it does by using that word, even though they're not coming from the same background. I think it automatically makes you think differently of the people that you worship with. I think if you see them as your friend, then that by seeing them like that, that sense of community is strengthened. And I think that's what's really important about Quakerism is that because everyone is equal, everyone can be friends. It's not like there's not that distance between you and maybe the priest in another denomination. We're all on an equal setting. We are all friends, and so that sort of equality means that there's no social barriers to overcome or anything like that. So the community can grow in a much more friendly way than maybe it can in other denominations. I don't know, but I think that word is quite nice to use, and as often as I can, especially when amongst other friends, I would use that term because I think it's endearing, and I think it's also nice that it has this sort of historical background and religion and biblical background as well. It might also be important to notice that when writing about writing friend, meaning a Quaker, you write a capital F, and the same way that you'd write a capital Q, to but also to distinguish it from a friend who's a friend, if you get what I mean. So that's that. I think it's just an important little video to do, just to talk about that word. It's one that comes up again and again and can cause confusion because that word is something that is used in the wider culture anyway. But it's also nice because I think it's got a biblical background that people don't necessarily know about, and the implications of that I think are quite important. Anyway, so thank you very much for watching, and please tune in for the next episode soon. Thank you very much for watching the video. If you liked it, please do click on the thumbs up and the subscribe button to get more videos about Quakerism in the UK today. It really does help, and thanks once again.